All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul. Shari Sora Wolasky for dedicating all the Sherman Sharshos this month. In the zechus of refuah sheleimah for Zecharya Dov ben Perel Shira. And to thank the Tilson and Wohl families from Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this month. Baruch Hashem, in honor of our children who were zocha to get married. Baruch Hashem, wishing everyone a Mazel Tov and a Shana Tova. Our week of learning sponsors, Nancy and David Berkowitz, in celebration of their son Jonathan's recent engagement to Rachel Harris. Mazel Tov to the new couple, and they should be zocha and Eretz Hashem to build the bayis naman b'Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. Baruch Hashem, a lot to do today. Today's daf is daf Yud 10. We are picking up in Eretz Hashem on Tes Samad Beis. I believe we left off 12 lines up from the bottom. For Rabbi Yochanan, Hai Uba'Allah, my oven lace. Suppose if you remember again, the last sugya, we did actually a lot in yesterday's daf, but the last sugya that we saw in yesterday's daf was the sugya of Kiddushin Bebiyah, the ability to go ahead and effect Kiddushin through marital relations. So there we had, so again, everyone is agreeing it works. The machlokes ultimately is, what's the source? So we had Rabbi Yochanan saying the pasuk was Be'ulas Baal, and we had Rabbi Zera explaining that ultimately, again, the pasuk was, or the phrase was, Uba'Allah. Uba'Allah. So we spent yesterday going back and forth trying to understand the need for both of these psukim, for each of these derivations. Then the Gemara today discusses as follows. Rabbi Yochanan, Hai Uba'Allah, my avidlay. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with the pasuk of Uba'Allah? What does he do with it? So the Gemara says, Hahu mibayile zu niknis bebiyah, vein amayvir niknis bebiyah. Ultimately, this teaches us that Allah Chalamaisa, this woman, in other words, a wife, is acquired with biyah, but ultimately an amma ivriya is not. Sagadai Chamina, I would have thought, Tisi v'kal v'chomer mi Yavama. Bring a kal v'chomer from Yavama. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma Yavama shei niknis bekesef niknis bebiyah. A Yavama who is not acquired with biyah. I'm sorry, a Yavama is not acquired with kesef, is acquired with biyah. Zu sheniknis bekesef eno din sheniknis bebiyah. Then certainly the amma ivriya, who is acquired with kesef, certainly should be acquired with biyah. To which the Gemara says it doesn't work. I'll tell you why. Mali Yavama shekin zekuka va'omedes. It's different. A Yavama, remember again, is zekuka. We'll say, what does zekuka mean? Zekuka means there's a zega. Ultimately, there's already a quasi-marital connection that exists because of the relationship, ultimately, again, with the deceased husband. So, because remember, we'll say this goes back to the yesod of Yibum. What is Yibum? When Reuven is married to Rachel and Reuven dies without children, and now Rachel marries Shimon, the surviving brother, as a form of Yibum. Remember, how do we view that Yibum marriage? It is in reality an extension of that previous marriage to Reuven. So it's different. Perhaps it's only a marriage like that halacha l'maisa could be fully affected by since it says since Rabbi said the pasuk by Amma Ivriya speaks about that if the master ends up marrying the Amma Ivriya, the Jewish maidservant, and then ends up taking another wife as well, he must treat the Amma Ivriya as well as he treats any other woman whom he marries. So Ikisha Kosav Lacheres. Torah goes ahead and compares her to another wife, Ma'acheres Mekanya Mabiyah. Just like another wife could be acquired with biyah. Amma Ivriya, Mekanya Mabiyah. Ultimately, an Amma Ivriya could also be acquired with biyah as well. Kamash Malon, she's not. Okay, so Rabbi says that's the. So Rabbi Yochanan uses the phrase Uba'Allah to teach me that biyah is only a mechanism to affect normative marriage, will not affect the acquisition of an Amma Ivriya. Good. V'reish Lakish, Berebi Hai Svar Minale. But say, from where does Rebbe know that an Amma Ivriya is not acquired with biyah? So we go to say, Imkin Lichtov Rachmana Uba'al. Torah could have just said Uba'al. My Uba'Allah. What does it mean Uba'Allah? Shma Mina Tarti. So say the fact that the Torah writes the longer form. Remember, we see this all the time. When the Torah could have written a word in a shorter form, but instead chooses to do so in a longer form, why does the Torah do that? to teach you additional teachings. By the way, it's an interesting idea, which actually teaches you a fascinating yesod. The assumption is people only utilize the minimum number of words. Right? Dibra Torah kalashon b'nei Adam. Kadosh Baruch Hu phrases the Torah. Ultimately, see, Dibra Torah kalashon b'nei Adam is a phrase that's often used to teach us that the Torah speaks in like common jargon, the way we speak. It could also mean Dibra Torah kalashon b'nei Adam means HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks the way He wants us to speak. How does God want us to speak? The ideal is use the minimum number of words possible. Right? First of all, in general, I'll say it's a good approach. Rav Pam, Zecharya Dov, was Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'das. His yard site was not too long ago. Rav Pam said, "What is the worst word in the English language?" Now, don't volunteer any guesses on this one, right? Right? What's the worst word in the English language? Rav Pam said, "Whatchamacallit." Whatchamacallit. He said, "Why?" Because if you're using the word whatchamacallit, that means you haven't thought about what you're going to say before you say it. He said a person should never begin to talk unless they have a fully articulated idea about what they're going to say and how they're going to say it. Otherwise, chas v'shalom, a person is just wasting words. It's such an incredible yesod. So I will say, so it's fascinating over here. So Rebbe says like this. Rebbe says, if the Torah just wanted to teach me that Kiddushin is affected by Bia, or through Bia, Torah would have just used the word Uba'al. Uba'al. Why does it use the word Uba'allah, which is a longer form of the word? It must be what? Shma mina tarti. The only reason the Torah would use a longer form of the word is because it wants to teach me something. What does it want to teach me? Number one, that Kiddushin could be affected by Bia. Number two, that an Amma Ivriya cannot be acquired through Bia. I want to say, isn't it an incredible yesod? Because had the Torah only wanted to teach me one lesson, it would have used the shortened form of the word. If it's using the elongated form of the word, it must be to teach me an additional lesson, a profound musar haskil to us about only use the words necessary to convey the ideas you want to do, right? You want to convey. No more and no less. Incredible. Rava Da'amar Barahina. And according to Rava, who said that Barahina is the name of a person, Asabrili, he explained to me, Kikach ish isha uba'Allah. That's right, when the Torah says, if a man will take a woman and have relations with her, this teaches us, Kiddushin ha-Mesurin l'biyah, hava Kiddushin. Kiddushin she'in Mesurin l'biyah, lo hava Kiddushin. So we'll say we're going to see this sugya later on. So Barahina explains the pasuk as follows. Torah says, Kikach ish ishu ba'ala. If a man will marry a woman and have relations with her. So what do we learn from this? Only a Kiddushin that could result in Bia is a valid Kiddushin. But a Kiddushin that cannot result in Bia is not a valid Kiddushin. So we'll discuss cases like this. Rashi actually has examples of this. For example, if a man went ahead and was Mekadesh a woman, but he doesn't know, or right, he was, Rashi says over here that he was Mekadesh one of two sisters, but he doesn't know which sister. It was a long night, right? He doesn't know which sister, right? So Lamaisa, now, we'll say what happens. He can't have relations. Why? Because one of those women is his wife, and one of those women is the sister of his wife, Achos Ishto, which is an erva. So that's an example of Kiddushin she'ein mesurin l'bia, a Kiddushin that cannot result in Bia, which is by definition an invalid Kiddushin. Okay, so we'll see more of this sugya later on. The point over here is Barahina explains that the entire phrase Kikach ish isha uba'Allah is to teach me that in order for Kiddushin to work, Bia has to be possible. It says the Gemara. So what could be said? The Gemara said, what could be said? So imkein nichtov kra o ba'ala o ba'ala. Torah could have said o ba'ala, my u ba'ala shma min akulu. It comes to teach me everything. So we'll say, so the longer form of u ba'ala, in reality, if you bring this all together, it could teach me all these different ideas. Number one, that Kiddushin could be affected by Bia. Number two, only a Kiddushin that could result in Bia is a valid Kiddushin. And number three, that an Amma Ivriya cannot be acquired through Bia. Fascinating. The Rebbe, Hi Bu'ulas Ba'amai Avidle. Suppose we were just asking what everyone does with the other drasha. And Rebbe, what does Rebbe do with the phrase Bu'ulas Baal? What does he do with it? Haimi Baile, Baal Osa Bu'ula Shelo Kidarka, Ve'in Acher Osa Bu'ula Shelo Kidarka. Shabbos say this is fascinating. What does Rebbe do with it? Rebbe uses it to teach me the following: that it is only the husband who can make his wife a Bu'ula with Bia Shelo Kidarka. We learned this in yesterday's sugya. So remember again, Rebbe understands like this: when a husband has relations with his wife, right, and it's Bia Shelo Kidarka, ultimately again, that makes her a Bu'ula. She is no longer a Basula. But if another man, i.e. not her husband, right, has relations with a woman, Bia Shelo Kidarka, she remains a Basula. It's a unique halacha by marriage. So the Gemara says, does Rebbe really agree with that? Vatanya we learned, also we saw this price in yesterday's daf. Vatanya we learned, Bo Aleh Yud Anoshim. If at the end of the day, it's not on. Was it on before? Oh. Okay. Vatanya, but we learned, so the Gemara says, Vatanya Bo Aleh Yud Anoshim, Va'adayin Hi Besula. If at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, there were 10 men had relations with a woman, but she's still a basula. So we had this in yesterday's daf. So remember again, what's that case? That's the case of Bia Shelo Kidarka. So 10 men had relations with a woman, but she's still a basula. So kulam b'skilba. So remember again, just to reorient ourselves with this case. The halacha is that normally, when a man has, when a person commits adultery, when a person commits adultery, sometimes it just gets knocked out of the thing. Yeah. When a person I'm sorry, I should have checked it. When a person commits adultery, so halacha said the penalty for adultery is chenek, strangulation. The difference just is if it's a nara hamu'urasa, a man has relations with a woman who is betrothed, i.e. a besula, so halacha it's skila. It's skila. So here's the case. So if you have a nara hamu'urasa, so 10 men, 10 men committed adultery with her, but she is still a besula, i.e. it was Bia Shelo Kidarka, so kulam beskila. Everyone ultimately again is punishable by skila. Rabbi Omer, because she's still a besula. Rabbi says, Omer ani, harisha beskila v'kulam b'chanek. Rabbi says, no. In fact, again, I believe the first one is punishable by skila, and the rest of them with chanek. The rest of them with strangulation. Because Rebbe holds that what? The first one has relations with her, is having relations with a basula. But after him, she is a ba'ula, even though what? It was Bia Shelo Kidarka. So you see from here that Rebbe holds that Bia Shelo Kidarka makes a woman a ba'ula, i.e. a non-basula. She's no longer a virgin, she's not a basula, even though it's not relations with her husband. Top of Yud, Amar Rabbi Zera, Moda Rebbe Le'iyin Knas Dekulu Mishalmi. So no, Rebbe will hold like this. Rebbe will hold that halacha l'maisa, all of the men have to pay a knas, a penalty payment. In other words, we'll say, so this is actually very interesting. So remember, in addition to the death penalty that happens ultimately again with Nara HaMurasa, there is also a knas. There's a knas ultimately for violating a besula. So Rebbe holds that halacha l'maisa, all of these men have to pay the penalty payment as if they violated a besula. The kula b'shalmi. So ma'ishna miktala. So I don't understand. Rebbe seems to be saying top of Yud 10a, second line down. Rebbe seems to be really playing this both ways. And on one hand, what he's saying is that halacha l'maisa, after the first guy, she's considered to be a ba'ula already. Okay? Which means that everyone after the first guy is going to be punished ultimately through chenek and not through skila. Yet, he makes them all liable for the knas, for the penalty payment of violating a besula. So it doesn't make sense. To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Shiny Hasam, Da'amakra umeis ha'ish asher shachav ima livado. So Rabbi will say, ultimately, again, Rabbi will say, here's the issue. The issue is when the Torah frames the death penalty for Nara HaMu'urasa, the Torah indicates to us that halacha l'maisa, who will be put to death? The man who slept with her, he by himself will be put to death. So the fact that the Torah used the lashon of livado means that there can only be one man put to death by skila for relations with a Nara HaMe'urasa. Who's the only man? The first guy. So when it comes to the actual death penalty of skila, it's only going to be one guy. I'm going to say the rest of them get chenek. I just want to be clear. Everyone gets the death penalty in this case, right? Just the first one gets skila, the rest of them get chenek. When it comes to knasa, of the penalty payment, Rebbe holds that ultimately the penalty payment devolves upon all of the men who engaged in this act of adultery with her. Okay, incredible. For Rabbanon, hay levado my avdile. What did the Rabbanon do with this phrase levado? Because we also remember again, the Rabbanon hold that halacha l'maisa, all of them get skila. So what do they do with levado? Ultimately, again, they need it for the following. Mesu gam shnehem. Pasuk says they will both be put to death. Ad shiu shaven ke'echad. So ultimately, again, that death penalty is only conferred upon both of them. That halacha l'maisa, when both of them are shaven, when both of them are the same. But what does it mean both the same? Look at Rashi. Shneim shaven. So this is actually interesting. The only time that the death penalty is conferred upon them is when they are both the same. In other words, when they are both of the age of liability. As opposed to if the man was a gadol and the woman or the girl was a kitana, there would not be a death penalty in such a situation like that. Okay. Rabbi Yonasan Omer, Omei Sa'ish Asher Shachav Ima Levado. Rabbi Yonasan says, on the other hand, no, that halacha l'maisa not true, even if the man was a gadol and the girl was a kitana, but she was betrothed, halacha l'maisa, he would still be put to death for that. And that's what we learn from Levado. Only if he himself, or even if he himself, is reached the age of liability, and she has not reached the age of liability, he would still be put to death. Incredible. Rabbi Yochanan, Hai Svar Minale. From where does Rabbi Yochanan know this svara? So we'll say, so again, going back for just a second, where does Rabbi Yochanan know that the husband has the ability to make his wife a ba'ula, even with bia shelo kidarka? From where does he learn that concept? To which the Gemara says, Imkein nichtov kra ba'ulas ish. Torah could have just said ba'ulas ish. My bu'ulas bal. What does it mean bu'ulas bal? Shma min atarti. Shabbos said it teaches me two things. Shabbos said, according to Rabbi Yochanan, bu'ulas bal teaches me two things. Number one, it teaches me that Kiddushin can be affected through bia. And number two, it teaches me that halacha l'maisa, a husband makes his wife a ba'ula with bia shelo kidarka. Shabbos says, so two different things. Two different things. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Bailahu. So we'll say, so therefore, just to kind of close this out for just a moment, what we see over here is everyone is agreeing that Allah Chalamaisa Bia affects Kiddushin. The Machlokes, where do you learn it out from? Where do you learn it from? Is it from Kikach Ish Isha Uba Allah, a man will marry a woman and have relations with her, or is it from the phrase Bu'ulas Baal? And we'll say what we just did, this process over the end of yesterday's daf, beginning of today's daf, is just to try to figure out what each side does with the other's pasuk. Beautiful. Now we come to a fascinating and Yisodistic idea. Tchilas bia kona osof. Actually, this is interesting, but not actually. Tchilas bia kona osof bia kona. We're actually going to talk about this in greater depth. In the act of bia, there's different stages. So the Gemara says, when we say that bia affects Kiddushin, so which stage of bia are we talking about? Is it tchilas bia or is it sof bia, what we call the beginning of bia, or is it the end of bia? And I will say, these stages themselves are subject to machlokes exactly what they are. So I will say, let's assume for a moment, for our purposes this morning, even though again, we're going to do this so get a bit more in depth, but for our purposes, that tchilas bia just means contact, physical contact between the male and female sexual organs. Whereas sof bia means penetration. We're going to see, I will say, it could be different. It could be that tchilas bia could actually mean penetration, whereas sof bia could actually mean actual like completion of the act. But again, for our purposes today, let's just go with initial contact versus penetration. So the Gemara says, nafkamina, where does this matter? Where could this be nafkamina? This is actually interesting. Kagon sheharaba upashta yada v'kibla kiddushin me'acher. So it's an interesting case, right? The case could be where maybe there was tchilas bia, the beginning of bia, but then she accepted Kiddushin from someone else. Hopefully not at the same time, right? Baklamaisa, again, Salamaisa. So I'll say, so now there was Tchilas Bia, and then she accepted Kiddushin from someone else. Inami, the Kohen Gadol. So this is actually very interesting. The other possibility is, what about a Kohen Gadol who's being, so I'll say, so again, she had Tchilas Bia, but she accepted Kiddushin from someone else. So if you say that Tchilas Bia affects Kiddushin, then the second Kiddushin is irrelevant. If you hold that it's Sof Bia, that's Kona, then what? Then ultimately again, then the second Kiddushin will be valid. Other possibility, Inami, L'Kohen Gadol. L'Kohen Gadol, ultimately, Dikakani Besula Babia. But the second possibility is by a Kohen Gadol who ultimately again is acquiring someone with bia. So we'll say, so remember again, a Kohen Gadol has to marry a besula, right? Has to marry a besula. So we'll say something very interesting. So what happens if a Kohen Gadol is mekadesh a woman through bia? So if you say that tchilas bia is kona, then fine, no problem. If you say sof bia is kona, so we'll say something very interesting happens over here, which is that by the time Kiddushin is affected, the woman is no longer a besula, which means that the Kohen Gadol wouldn't be able to marry. So hear this fascinating idea. So again, a Kohen Gadol has to marry a besula. If you hold tchilas bia kona, that the beginning of bia affects Kiddushin, then fine. Then he's being mekadesh a besula. If you hold that sof bia kona, that means that by the time the act is, so to speak, completed, she's no longer a besula. Right, because also remember again, by the time the act is completed already, penetration has occurred. In which case, she's no longer a besula. In which case, he's no longer allowed to marry her. So my Amar Ameir Mishnei Rava call a boil daita al gbar bia. So I'll say, so again, Ameir said the name of Rava. Any time that the man is affecting Kiddushin through bia, his intention is for the completion of the act. So once again, we're assuming now that completion means penetration, but halacha l'maisa, we'll see that this is actually subject to some of the. Also, we're actually going to see that even contemporarily, this could actually have dramatic halachic repercussions. Again, especially sometimes for a new couple. Again, we'll get into this a little bit more later on when we get to the sugya. Ibailu. Go to Boss says Kavaiter. So now Boss say this is a very important shayla. So Ibailu, bia nisunosa o erisinosa. So Boss say here's the interesting question. When we say that you could affect Kiddushin with bia, so Rabbi say, is bia like one-stop shopping? Like in other words, so once you do bia, that's Kiddushin and Nisuin? Or no, bia's Kiddushin, and you would still have to go out and do Nisuin after. So Rabbi say, remember, just it's interesting how we think. Like, if you think about it in the Mishnah, so that there are three ways, right? Ha'isha niknis b'shlosha drachim, right? There are three ways you can affect Kiddushin. Kesef, shtar, and bia. And I will say, in our minds, if you do kesef and shtar, right, for Kiddushin, what has to happen afterwards? Or nisuin, whatever nisuin is going to be, or nisuin. So it's like, in our minds, so bia is often, again, especially just the way contemporarily we conduct ourselves, bia is a culminating event, right? It's a culminating event. So now the Gemara is asking, by the way, if a man is mekadesh woman with bia, does that affect both Kiddushin and Nisuin? So that now we're done, right? The marriage is done. Or does it really just affect Kiddushin, and therefore you still need a Nisuin act afterwards? Such an interesting shayla. To which the Gemara says, "Say bailu bia Nisuin osa, oeris osa nafkamina." So we'll say, what's nafkamina to this? So first of all, it's interesting that the Gemara has to ask what's the nafkamina. The nafkamina is obvious, right? The nafkamina is what? What's nafkamina? Dini nisuin, right? Okay, but the Gemara says, but there are other nafkaminas as well. Liyarsha, litamela, ulahafer nedara. So let's say some other interesting nafkaminas over here. Let's say Reuven is mekadesh Rachel with bia, and then Rachel dies. Before quote unquote there's an nisuin. Therefore, that technically speaking, a husband only inherits his wife after Nisuin, not after Kiddushin. So does he inherit her? Or, again, same case, Reuven is married to Rachel. Reuven did Kiddushin Bebia with Rachel. Reuven's a Kohen. Now Rachel died. Could Reuven go to her Levaya? Normally, a Kohen can only become Tameh for his wife after there was Nisuin. Lahafer Nedarel. A husband only has the ability to annul his wife's vows by himself after Nisuin. So iyarmet nisuin osa. So if you say that bia, when you're mekadesh b'bia, bia also affects nisuin. If you say that, then yarsha, he inherits her. Mitamela, if he's a kohen, he goes to her levaya. Umefer nedara, he could annul her vows. Biyarmet erisin osa. But if you say that halacha, so all bia does, not all bia does, but bia is a mechanism for kiddushin. And therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, all it does is erisin, then eina yarsha, then ultimately he would not inherit her, ve'ena metamela, and he would not make her tamei, ve'ena mefer nidareha, and he would not annul her vows. So so I will say, what is the halacha? What is the halacha? So we'll say, so this is the yesodistic shaila, that we're dealing with over here. Halacha l'maisa, when we say that bia affects marriage, does it only affect Kiddushin, or does it affect Nisuin as well? Amar Abaye. So Abaye says, Tashma, ha'av zakai bebito, bekidusha, bekesa, b'shtar bebia. So we'll say, so now look at this brisa. So the brisa says as follows. A father is entitled, right, has rights in his daughter's Kiddushin, whether that Kiddushin is affected through kesef, shtar, and bia. So we'll say if it's kesef, the father has the ability to receive kesef. Now remember again, this is assuming that she is a nara and below, right? So she gets her kesef. Shtar, he's able to receive her shtar, and bia, he's able to give her over, for marriage, for bia. Furthermore, he's entitled to anything she finds. He's also entitled to her earnings, and he has the right to annul her vows. And ultimately, again, he receives her get. But I will say, if she inherits property, let's say from her mother's family, the father does not have rights in that property. Okay, that's part one of the brisa. Part two of the brisa, nises, if she gets married, nisuin, yasser alav habal, a husband has even greater entitlements than a husband. Than a father. Because we'll say, unlike a father who doesn't have rights in the property of his daughter, ultimately a husband will have usage rights in the property of his wife. Now we'll say, why is this brisa important for us? We'll say, listen to how the brisa was structured. The brisa spoke about the idea that a father has the right to go ahead and give his daughter over in Kiddushin, right? Bekesef, bishtar, ubebia. Then it says, nises, if she gets married. So we'll say, if you look at the brisa, how does the brisa look at bia? The brisa looks at bia as a mechanism for Kiddushin, and then talks about nisuin separately. It would appear from here that what? That halacha l'maisa, bia only affects Kiddushin, does not affect nisuin. Katani nises. So it was like katani bia, the katani nises. So it sounds like what it's saying over here is there's bia, which can affect Kiddushin, and then there's nises, there's nisuin. So we'll say, see from here, that when bia is used as a mechanism for Kiddushin, it only affects Kiddushin and not nisuin. To which the Gemara says, ki katani nises ashara. No. When it says nises, It's referring ultimately again to everything else. Referring to kesef and shtar, but not to bia. But it's also that bia itself would affect erisin and nisuin. Amar Rava. So we'll say the question is still unanswered. So our overarching question is still intact, which is when bia is used for erisin, for nisuin, does that affect only nisuin? Sorry. When bia is used for kiddushin, does it only affect kiddushin, or does it affect kiddushin and nisuin? Amar Rava, Tashma. Rava says as follows: Tashma, bas shalosh shanim v'yom echad. When ultimately, again, if you have a girl who is 3 years old in one day, miskadeshes bebia. So ultimately, again, technically speaking, she could become mikudeshes with bia. And I will say, I just want to point out, we mentioned this. We mentioned this again already in Ksuvas. How strange, right? Not just strange. How wrong, right? Clearly, like this is it's hard. Again, just so remember. Also, we also saw how Chazal clearly frowned upon this type of kiddushin as well. But I will say, but again, there's a difference between in any time you have like a legal discussion. There's what legally could work, but sometimes what legally could work is not at all what should be done. So again, that's why we're gonna approach this. There's a phrase halacha yevesha. Halacha yevesha just means the dry halacha, right? Just the facts, devoid of any emotion, or for that matter, again, in this case, practicality. So let's just look at it as like a legal construct. So bas shalosh shana v'yom echad. So a girl is 3 years old in one day. Miskadeshes bebia, which just means that bia becomes a halachically recognized act. Past the age of 3 years old in one day, lower than that age, the bia is not recognized as a legal act. Then ba leha yavam kina. So if a yavam had relations, they're required for yibam. And ultimately, again, if her father actually betrothed her, so relations with her with another man would be chayiv because of adultery. Umetame as baala, the amid base, letame mishkav tachton ke'elyon. And I will say, ultimately, again, technically speaking, I will say this is why this case also is actually interesting. If she were to become a nida, ultimately, again, and her husband were to have relations with her, she would confer upon him tumas nida. So we'll say, again, as manifest by his ability to go ahead and be metame mishkav tachton kelyon. So we'll say, tumas nida has an interesting chumrah to it. And it's not a chumrah, it's a function of the tumah. And that, remember, we'll say, imagine you have a pile of cushions, and a woman who is a nida sits on the top cushion. What's the halacha? All of the cushions, ultimately below her, are tmeah as well, even though she did not come in contact with them. Well, the man who has relations with a nida essentially acquires this same level of tumah. Now, I will say, now it's not exactly the same. If you take a look at the top Rashi, we're on 10b, Yudamid base. Take a look at the top Rashi. L'tami mishkav tachton kelyon she'osa bo'ala moshav mishkav afilu eser matzos. So I will say, so again, the same way that a woman who is a nida ultimately confers tumah upon all of these cushions, right? 10, he's using lashon of 10, right? 10 stacked one on top of the other. So too again, if a man has relations with a woman who is a nida, he acquires that same level of tumah. Avalolios avatoma letame adam ekelim ki mishkava shal nida asma elotame ochlun mashkin. I will say, now the difference is when the nida herself confers tumah upon the cushions, ultimately again they have the ability to go ahead and make other people tameim. The husband's or the man's tumah is not that same heightened level of tumah. He can't make his cushions, so to speak, can't make people tameh, but ultimately, again, they can go ahead and make food and drink tameh. Okay, v'miseis l'kohen. We'll say back Yudam Adalef 10b, first line. V'miseis l'kohen. But if ultimately, again, she marries a kohen, ochelas b'truma. Ultimately, again, she's permitted to eat truma. And if any one of the arayos in the Torah have relations with her, mumsin al yada, they could be put to death as a result of that act of relations. Fihi petura. But I will say she'll be petura. Why is she petura? She's a ketana. I will say if she has relations with someone who is pasul, ultimately it would invalidate her from marrying into the kuna. So I'll say once again, what do you see from here? Katani bia v'katani nises. I will say once again, the truth is we're not really so concerned with the subject matter with this price. So what are we focused on? We're focused on the categorical organization. And that the way the price is set up, Rabbi say, is the price is set up ultimately, again, it's talking about bia and then talking about nisuin. Right? So Rabbi say, it says, Bas shalosh shanim miskadeshes bebia. So right, once she's 3 years old in one day, Kiddushin can be affected with bia. And then Rabbi say, and then the price says, in nises, if she does nisuin. Which sounds like what? Bia does not affect nisuin. That's what it sounds like. So Bia could affect Kiddushin. Bia doesn't affect nisuin. To which the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar, no, this is what it means to say. Ihani nisuin dekoininu ochalas betruma. Then I will say, don't read in nises as a separate category, but rather again read it as imhani nisuin dekoininu. If the nisuin that was affected by the bia was to a kohen, then she can eat truma. So it's not introducing a new category of nises, but rather it's introducing a new case of nisuin to a kohen. But it's possible that ultimately bia affects kiddushin as well as nisuin. Good. Shabbos says, let's go a little bit weiter. We're not finished yet. Good. So says the Gemara. Tashma. Ukvar shalach Yochanan ben Bagbag eitzel Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira the Nitzivin. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan ben Bagbag sent Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Nitzivin. Shamati alecha sha'ata omer. I heard that you say Arusa bas Yisrael ochelas betruma. Right? I heard that you hold that Narusa bas Yisrael can eat truma. So let's just to illustrate what this is. Rachel is marrying Ruvain. Ruvain is a Kohen. So now Avo says, take a simple case. Ruvain gives Rachel kesef. Hariat mikudeshas li bekesef zu. Fine. So now Irisin, they're married. So watch this. So now Yochanan ben Bagbag sent Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Rabbi Yehuda, I heard that you say that an Arusa, who's a Bas Yisrael, is allowed to eat Truma. Shalach lo. So Rabbi Yehuda sends back. Viata, Iyata Omakein, Yochanan ben Bagbag, you hold that she can't eat Truma? Muchsekani b'cha sha'atabaki b'chadrei Torah. Lidrosh b'ka b'chomer iyata yodea. So I say it's incredible. So Rabbi Yehuda says to Yochanan ben Bagbag, I heard that you are well versed in the chedrei, in the intricacies of Torah, and you don't even know how to darshna kal b'chomer. After all, umash shivcha kinanis shein bi'asa machilasa b'truma. If a shivcha kinanis, I will say. So remember again, a man wants to acquire shivcha. He has bia with the shivcha. I will say, what does bia with the shivcha do? Right? Nothing. That does not entitle her to truma. Kaspa machilasa b'truma. Only once he gives her money, acquires her, does that entitle her to truma. Zu, a regular woman, shebi asa machilasa b'truma. Ultimately, again, where bia does entitle her to eat truma. Eino dinsha kaspa machilasa b'truma. Goes without saying that kesef kiddushin, giving her money, should certainly go ahead and allow her to eat truma. So this, I just want to point out, this is Rabbi Yehuda's retort to Yochanan ben Bagbag. So Rabbi Yehuda of Nitzivin, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, ultimately goes ahead and says back to Yochanan, of course an Arusa should be able to go ahead and eat Truma, because it's Kal V'chomer. If an Amma Ivriya, where Bia with an Amma Ivriya does not entitle her to eat Truma, but Kesef does, so a regular woman, where Bia would entitle her to eat Truma, Kesef certainly does. But again, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira said, "Ba'ad ma'asa shari amru chachamim ein arusa bas Yisrael lo chalas b'truma ad shetikanes l'chopa." So I say, so ultimately, again, but what can I do? What can I say? Now I say, now this Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira is saying, even though I believe that an arusa should be able to eat truma, but what can I do? Chazal said an arusa doesn't eat truma. So I have no choice. What can I do? An arusa doesn't eat truma until she enters into the chuppah. Rabosai, now what we're focused on over here is the very interesting use of bia, right? So how is bia being used in this marital relationship? Hechi dami, iba bia sha'al yidei chuppah, v'kesef sha'al yidei chuppah. So we'll say if we're talking about bia that follows chuppah, right? Or I should say bia sha'al yidei chuppah, right? Or bia that comes with the chuppah. In other words, if it's bia's kiddushin and then a chuppah, or kesef ayidei chuppah, so b'tarvayo mecha achra. So as I said, obviously everyone agrees that if both of these mechanisms are used, then obviously the woman in question can eat truma. Now the bia sha'ayidei chuppah, the kesef sha'ayidei chuppah. Is it talking about bia with chuppah and kesef? Bia with chuppah and kesef without chuppah. So then hacha tarti v'hacha chada. Then I will say, one case you have two mechanisms, one case you have one. Elalav bebia shelo ayidei chuppah, the kesef shelo ayidei chuppah. Rather, I will say, in this halachic discussion, we must be talking about over here. We must be talking about that both the bia and kesef in question was without chuppah. Now watch this. I amrit b'shlamini suin osa mishum hachi pshitale da'alimale bia mikesef. So I will say, if halacha lamaisi you hold that bia by itself works to what? Affect kiddushin and nisuin, then it makes sense to say that bia should be more powerful than kesef. Ale I amrit kiddushin osa, but halacha lamaisi all bia does osa is what? Is kiddushin, then ma'ishna hacha de pshitale, or ma'ishna hacha de mesapkale. Then I will say if all bia does is what? Is go ahead and halacha might affect kiddushin, then why should there be any difference with kiddushin done with kesef, kiddushin done with bia? Halacha might say either way she shouldn't be able to eat truma. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak the olam eimul lachaba bia sha'ayidei chuppah, the kesef sha'ayidei chuppah. We're talking about a case of bia with chuppah and kesef without chuppah. So maybe you'll say, but in one case you're utilizing two mechanisms, in one case only one. Nevertheless, the kal v'chomer still works. This is what he meant to send to him. Here's the kal v'chomer. By shifcha kinanis, I will say where bia does not entitle her to eat truma. Afilu ayidei chuppah. We'll say even with chuppah, right? Even if there's bia and chuppah, those are not mechanisms that entitle a shifcha kinanis to go ahead and eat truma. Kasva ma'achila sebelo chuppah. Yet I will say again, kesef will work for an ama ivriya. Sorry, for a shifcha kinanis. Even right, kesef will work even without chuppah. Zu shebi asa ma'achila sebetruma ayidei chuppah. But by a regular woman, I will say, where bia followed by chuppah will allow her to eat truma. Certainly money, right, kesef kiddushin, should allow her to eat truma even without chuppah. Interesting kal v'chomer. Ma'aseh shar amru chachamim ein arusa bas Yisrael locheles b'truma ad shetikanes l'chuppah mishum du'ula. Rabbi say, but again, so just want to point out, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir says, but what could I do? So we'll say, so just before we go on, so we'll say, so what you have over here is a fundamental machlokes. Yochanan ben Bagbag saying that an arusa cannot go ahead and eat truma during Erisin. Okay? Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir is saying, yes, she can, and he bases it on a kal v'chomer. And his kal v'chomer essentially, I will say, is that by shivcha kinanis, even if you have bia with a chuppah that doesn't allow her to eat truma, yet kesef does, then for a regular woman where bia with chuppah would allow her to eat truma, certainly what? Kesef by itself should. So that is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir's kal v'chomer that an arusa should be able to go ahead and eat truma. But then Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir says, but what could I do? Chazal said that an arusa cannot eat truma. Now here he says over here, mishum du'ula. Now what did Ula say before? We actually had Ula, we had Ula back on Daf Hey. Ula said, do you know why an arusa can't go ahead and eat truma? What are we concerned about? Because an arusa is still living where? Rachel is still living in her father's home. So what we're concerned about is if Ruvain, her betrothed, gives her truma, which technically she could eat, what are we concerned about? she's going to take that truma home and feed it to her Yisrael family. So we'll say, so that's right. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying, I think my kal v'chomer is a compelling kal v'chomer to allow an arusa to eat truma. But what can I do? Ula, they have a concern that if she's eating truma, she's living in her father's home, she's going to come to go ahead and eat truma. Ben bagbag. So we'll say the reason why Ben Bagbag rejects the Kal V'chomer, because he feels you're not really equating the two. In other words, halacha l'maisa, once you go ahead and you give a shifcha kinanis money, they will say, what happens? You're done. It's full, right? It's complete. The transaction is complete. When you give a Jewish woman money, that's kesef kiddushin. They will say it's not complete. You still need nisun. They will say, now just to contextualize everything, why are we doing this? You're like, I just had that same question, right? Why are we doing this? They will say, remember again, our overarching question is bia, right? What does bia do? Does when a man uses bia for kiddushin, does that affect kiddushin and nisun, or just kiddushin? This is being brought up, I will say, because interestingly enough, if you notice, how is bia being used in this context? Bia is being used in this context as kiddush, a mechanism for kiddushin, but does not affect nisuin. That's how if you look at this, that's the whole reason this is being brought up. And happens to be, now we're being introduced to a fascinating machlokes between Ben Bagbag, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Bagbag, and Rabbi Yehuda Ben Beseira. So fascinating machlokes. So I will say, bottom line, by the way, over here, everyone is agreeing that an arusa is not going to go ahead and eat truma. The question is just going to be why. According to Rabbi Yochanan Ben Bagbag, he really feels midaraisa she can. According to Rabbi Yehuda Ben Beseira, she absolutely can. It's a din d'Rabbanan. I just want to use the last minute just to say something interesting. If you notice, by the way, in this discussion between Rabbi Yochanan, right? So Yochanan Ben Bagbag sent the question to Rabbi Yehuda Ben Beseira. He said to Rabbi Yehuda Ben Beseira, right? I heard that you allow an arusa bas Yisrael to go ahead and eat truma. So Rabbi Yehuda Ben Beseira sends back to him. Right? Of course, right? I thought that you were a person. Muchsakani becha sha'ata baki bechedrei Torah lidrash b'kav v'chomer. So he sends back to him. I thought you were an expert in Torah, in chedrei Torah, in the secret dimensions or the inner pieces of Torah, or I'm certainly not a darshan b'kav v'chomer. What does that mean? What does that exchange? So I'll tell you something amazing. The Chafetz Chaim, listen to this. The Chafetz Chaim explained this with a mashal. Well, first it says like this. Chafetz Chaim asks, what is the proper way to learn? What is the proper way to learn? He says, Ezu derech sheyavra adam b'limudo. Im yercho shlo b'kiyas b'mesachas miyuchedes, o sheyishtadel es kol hashas af ki pacho shinun. Rabbi say, listen to what the Chafetz Chaim's kasha is. When learning, should a person only focus himself on one Masechta and know it really well? Or should a person perhaps learn a lot, even though he doesn't retain everything? So it's like, what's the shaila? Should I learn Daf Yomi? Or ultimately, again, maybe focus on something a bit more be'iyan? So the Chafetz Chaim answered, he said, Sarech Adam Ladas Kamarach Bashal Torah Shal Shem Yisparach. He says it's clear. Person has to know as much of the wide expanse of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah as possible. Chafetz Chaim says, see as much as you can. And he gives a mashal. He gives the mashal of a man. He says, a person who only focuses himself on one Masechta and doesn't see the expanse there. He says, you know what he's like? He's like a guy who saves up all of his money for a beautiful hat. Hat is the best hat you could possibly buy, but the rest of his clothing is tattered. When you wear that nice hat, you look foolish, because at the end of the day, it stands in contrast to your tattered clothing. As opposed to, says the Chafetz Chaim, when you go ahead and you see the expanse of Torah, what does that do? That gives you a beautiful outfit. Says Rabbi Chanan Wasserman Hashem Yikom Damo. That's the pshat in that phrase. Muchsekani becha sha'ata baki bechedrei Torah lijosh b'kav v'chomer eni yodea. So Rabbi Yehuda Ben Beseira was sending back to Yochanan Ben Bagbag the following idea. He says, I know you know Chedrei Torah. Rabbi say, what's Chedrei Torah? Specific areas of information. Rabbi say, in order to know a Kal V'chomer, what do you need? You need expansive knowledge. Because in order for a kal v'chomer to work, there can't be a pircha. There can't be something that breaks it or undermines it. In order to know if there's a pircha, then what? You have to know the vast breadth of Torah knowledge. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira was giving a little bit of a shtach to Yochanan ben Bagbag. He says, I heard that you're proficient in certain areas, but don't you know enough of the expansiveness of Torah in order to know kal v'chomer as well? So I says Yochanan in Hashem Yikom Damo, this was the explicit raya to the fact that the Chafetz Chaim was correct. That Allah Chalamaysa, and this justifies and makes us feel a little bit better. Because sometimes we learn the daf, we learn the wide expanse of Torah, and we feel a little bit frustrated that we can't go ahead and retain everything. Chafetz Chaim is on our side. And the Chafetz Chaim says the best thing in your learning is to be able to see as much as possible to gain the full appreciation, a panoramic view of the Ribono Shalom's incredible Torah. So I'll stop over here today. Shkoyach.